Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Justice Department drafting a list of domestic terrorists, and then in parentheses, you are likely on the list if you read this sub, posted by from LATimes.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I ultimately think that I'm personally against terrorists and terrorism as labels, because ultimately the government can just label anyone they don't like as terrorist. Even if it's just for saying the wrong things or posting the wrong things online. And that just goes to show you that ultimately the government can add you to as many watch lists and add whatever labels it wants to you, and ultimately there's nothing you can do about it. I think the libertarian perspective is you should the more government watch list and labels you have, the more libertarian you arguably are, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Judge orders Abrego Garcia's immediate release from ICE custody from thehill.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Moderate Politics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't know why they're so focused on this guy. They always seem to care. I don't know if this guy is a crisis actor or something. But yeah, I don't know why they can't just shut up about this guy, because if they can ignore all the people that they deport. I think if they focus on this guy, because they're always innocent, but they ignore all the gang members that actually did get deported, and it just goes to show you the left will always try and manipulate things to suit their narrative. And yeah, I'm not gonna act like the right and other political perspectives don't do that too. But it's very much how Reddit works. Reddit's very much DNC propaganda, and this guy was arguably one of the biggest DNC propaganda stories of the year. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have FBI official stumped on Antifa facts after claiming it's the top U.S. terrorist organization, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the March Against Nazis subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Antifa. Antifa is just pretty much the left-wing equivalent of like Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. But of course, Reddit always says, oh, those are organizations. Antifa's not an organization. It just means anti-fascist. And it just goes to show you, that Reddit, they'll always find an excuse to get the in-group out of any blame whatsoever. Antifa can burn down a building, and Reddit would just sweep it under the rug, saying, "Oh, it was just a bunch of MAGA LARPing as Antifa." But it just goes to show you that Reddit will never take responsibility for what their side does when it comes to violence. It's like how when the guy who killed Charlie Kirk, they said, "Oh, he's a groyper. He's from the right. He's right at Charlie Kirk," and it just goes to show you that they were celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, but they still couldn't think a member of their side could have done it, because all political violence has to be from the out group rather than the in group. And that's very much how a lot of politics works these days. You always blame the out group, will find excuses for the in group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Also, I love how they say, oh, Antifa is just anti-fascism, as if, someone who names the name of something is always going to describe how it is. It's like, if you say, oh, they say Antifa is just anti-fascism, then you say the Nazis are socialists, because that's what is in the name, Nationalist Socialist Journalist Workers' Party, and that North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Ultimately, just because something's named something doesn't mean it's actually going to fit that label name. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. intends to seize oil from tanker catcher near Venezuela, White House says, from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, who had piracy on the bingo card for this administration. And yeah, I personally really don't care about the U.S. getting involved in regime change from Venezuela. I hear that, I saw on Twitter, it might be Israel pushing it, and because they want to get eyes off of the Israel-Palestine stuff and onto another part of the world. But regardless, the U.S. is always going to be bombing and drone striking countries, regardless of which president's in power. Under George W. Bush, it was Iraq and Afghanistan. Under Obama, it was Syria and Libya. Under Trump first term, I guess he's kind of Syria and Libya as well. Under Biden, it was Ukraine and Israel. And now under Trump, looks like Venezuela's on the list. And it just goes to show you that, the U.S. is always going to be acting as the world police, even though the people are saying, "Oh, the U.S. is retreating inwards under Trump." That might be how Trump's marketing himself. But the U.S. is always going to essentially be the world police, even if people don't like that. And yeah, personally, I don't know if we'll get a boots on the ground invasion, since the Iraq War was such a failure and so damaging for the Republican Party politically back in the 2000s. But I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. Next, we have House overturns Trump executive order in historic vote from Axios.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I do think that's good when it comes to executive orders being held accountable by checks and balances. But ultimately, still a lot of people are going to deflect. I think, or not deflect. I guess deflect to whatever the president says. And so ultimately, if Trump wants to say the executive order is still legitimate, even if the House technically overturned it, ultimately people are gonna usually go with whatever the president says. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump signs executive order seeking to block states from regulating AI companies from NBCNews.com. Posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, the order directs Attorney General Pam Bondi to create an AI litigation task force of 30 days whose sole responsibility shall be to challenge state AI laws that clash with the Trump administration's vision for light touch regulation. In addition, the order instructs Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick to identify existing state laws that require AI models to alter their truthful outputs, echoing earlier Trump administration efforts to prevent what it calls woke AI. States found to have these onerous laws may have to enter into agreements not to enforce those statutes in order to receive discretionary federal funding. And my thoughts on that are, I do think states' rights are important, and I do think, it's, the smaller the government, the more local the government, the better, the more it can actually enforce its laws. But with that being said, I think any regulation at all on any company is authoritarian. So I do think, this is the federal government blocking regulation when it comes to AI companies. And I do think the libertarian position on AI is, ultimately you don't have to like it, but you do have to, if people want to use it for what they want to feel like using it for, they should be able to use it for that. Because, ultimately it's just another tool. People may misuse it like they do with guns and abortions and all the other stuff that libertarians kind of think people should be able to do. But, ultimately, the libertarian perspective is, if you want to just try doing everything with AI, that's fine, but government regulation isn't the answer. So I do think, the libertarian position should be, you shouldn't be regulating AI companies. So I do think you should, I personally would agree with Trump here that, I personally don't like the federal government telling the state governments and local governments what to do. But, ultimately, that just because the federal government overrules the state or local governments doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherently authoritarian. I would argue in this instance that the federal government is pushing the more libertarian position rather than the state or local governments pushing more authoritarian position in regulating AI companies. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Impeach Him Now, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's cross-post from the Midas Touch subreddit, Mob Boss, and that's a tweet from Ron Filipkowski, who tweeted, the U.S. government is now a mafia organization, and they quote-tweeted Heritage Action, who said, President Trump's made clear to Indiana leaders, if the Indiana Senate fails to pass the map, all federal funding will be stripped from the state, roads will not be paved, guard bases will be closed, major projects will stop, these are the stakes, and every no vote will be to blame, hashtag pass the map. And yeah, personally, I think that's another thing that kind of goes against states' rights. But ultimately, if the federal government wants to withdraw any federal funding to any state for whatever reason, ultimately they're the ones in control of the purse strings. So ultimately, I personally don't think they should be taking away Indiana's federal funding for not passing their gerrymandered Senate map. But ultimately they have the power of the purse to justify doing whatever they want to on that front. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And yeah, personally, I like how the post is telling impeach him now and doesn't mention impeachment once in the whole thing. But, ultimately, I think any impeachment of Trump at this point would be a virtue signal. You've already tried to impeach him twice. I don't think, some people say third time's a charm, but I don't know. I think Trump is too much political capital right now to actually get impeached and removed from office. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump team emailed Epstein, pedophiles, I want you to know how important you are to me, from rawstory.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the Joe Rogan Reach Around subreddit. And yeah, it says Epstein once called Trump his closest friend for 10 years. With the House Oversight Committee's release revealing that Trump might have spent hours with one of Epstein's victims at his home and may have spent Thanksgiving with Epstein during his first term in office. Trump has also flown on Epstein's private jet at least 7 times in the 1990s. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but Reddit only cares about Trump, or they only care about Epstein because of his ties to Trump. They don't care about his ties to any of the other elite class members like Bill Clinton or Prince Andrew. It's only Trump that they care about. And ultimately, I think the libertarian position is it's a big club you ain't in it. Trump does probably have some ties with Epstein, but ultimately they all do. And I think it's because Epstein was being used by Israel and Mossad, specifically the Israeli CIA, to blackmail the elite class, and that's why I think why Trump was so in bed with Epstein, and they all were pretty much, because it was an Israeli intelligence op to blackmail the elite class into supporting Israel even more than they currently do. And it looks like Trump really is deep in it, because he's really deep in Israel's pockets. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Sanders accuses Trump of authoritarianism in Warner Bros. Battle from FoxBusiness.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they add less competition, more centralized control. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the government getting involved in private business, but Sanders is kind of authoritarian as well when it comes to the government getting involved in private business. But of course, Reddit, they'll always support him because he has a because he's always been viewed as a member of the in-group, even though, I used to be a Bernie supporter, but, I think the DNC cucked him over too hard, and ever since then, he's pretty much been just a pawn for them, just like any other generic DNC senator, even if he is technically an independent. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICC faces sanctions unless court agrees not to prosecute Trump, from USAtoday.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, Washington, President Donald Trump's administration wants the International Criminal Court to amend its following document to ensure it does not investigate the holding president and his top officials, a Trump administration official said, threatening new U.S. sanctions on the court if it did not. If the court does not act in the U.S. to demand two others, dropping investigations of Israeli leaders over the Gaza war and formally ending an earlier probe of U.S. troops over their action in Afghanistan, Washington may penalize more ICC officials and could sanction the court itself, the official said. And yeah, I personally don't care for the ICC. I don't really care for an unelected globalist court. But with that being said, ultimately, I don't know if sanctioning them is the answer. The U.S. already isn't part of their signatory to the ICC, so I don't think the U.S. should have anything to do with the ICC. If the U.S. government wants to justify sanctioning the ICC, I think it should be able to, but I personally think the libertarian position in the ICC is just ignore them and every other intergovernmental organization, because, ultimately, all intergovernment organizations are simply a ploy for a one-world government globalist Marxism, and that's not something that I personally care for from a libertarian perspective. Next, we have graphic of American air and naval assets assembled around Venezuela. Hard to imagine this much firepower has been collected not to be used. Posted by Legio X. And that looks like a bunch of diagram U.S. Army Command Southcom air and naval assets. And it looks like a bunch of ships and planes and a diagram of all those. And yeah, personally, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I personally think it will just be, I think it might just blow over, or it might just be some small-scale drone strikes. I don't think you're going to get boots on the ground after how, as I said earlier, after how damaging the Iraq War was to the Republican Party of the 2000s politically, but I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. Next, we have Trump claims to pardon jailed Colorado election clerk Tina Peters, but state officials contend it's unconstitutional, from abcnews.go.com, and that's a post from Ninja Lover, and they added one of the most basic principles of our Constitution is that states have independent sovereignty and manage their own criminal justice systems without interference from the federal government, Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser said in a statement Thursday. The idea that a president could pardon someone tried and convicted in a state court has no precedent in American law would be an outrageous departure from what our Constitution requires and will not hold up, he added. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to justify overruling the state there, I think ultimately he can justify doing whatever he wants. As I said earlier, I said deflect, but I meant defer. A lot of people are going to defer to whatever the president says. But, ultimately, I do think states' rights are important as well. But ultimately, when the state government and federal government disagrees, the federal government usually wins out, and that's very much a result of the Civil War, proving that the federal government is superior when it comes to ultimately who controls the force of the government. Because you might not like slavery, but when the federal government used all its power to abolish it, that eventually led to the federal government ultimately does have superiority over all the state governments, whether you like it or not, most of the time. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the ultimate evolution of libertarianism is Marxist-Leninism/Trotskyism, posted by cryptographer Few for 6492, and they added, there wasn't an unpopular opinion flare, so I decided to make the discussion post instead. As Dale says, I think at the end of libertarianism is just Marxism light. If one reads actual communist philosophy, it's strikingly close to what a lot of libertarians talk about wanting a society. Pure communism is a stateless society where everyone is equal. Edit, I should have specified they meant left libertarianism, and capital libertarianism is slavery in a suit. And yeah, personally, I would disagree with that. I think libertarianism is very much voluntary collectivism, while I think Marxist-Leninism/Trotskyism is more forced collectivism. I think if people want to live in voluntary Marxist-Leninist or Trotskyist communities, I think they should be able to. But I think when you're using the force of the government to force everyone to live in a Marxist-Leninist or Trotskyist community, I don't think that's very libertarian. I think libertarians are all about forced collectivism or voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. Next, we have Why Wars Offer Economically, posted by Roald Rolf, set 4713, and that's crosspost from the Austrian Economics subreddit. And they added, tomorrow at 12 a.m. Eastern, I will be releasing an article on why war is economically inviable. Most people can understand why it's morally awful, but no many are aware of its economic faults. I will link the website in the comment. And I agree with that. War I guess I kind of agree with that. War is definitely going to cost you a lot of manpower, but it might it does help the economy, I would say, in some ways, like, when it comes to factory production of weapons and all that. But ultimately, I definitely do think war is unlibertarian, even if it might be, you could argue that it could be helpful economically sometimes, like it wasn't like regards to World War II and the production that war entailed when it came to producing weapons and all that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. That's why I think the military-industrial complex is such a big thing, because war is oftentimes profitable, especially for the weapons companies like Lockheed Martin or Halliburton. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then there was one more post I wanted to share. When I was post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, I said, what was the biggest win for liberty in 2025? And I posted that. I said, every year I try to ask what the biggest win for liberty was, and since this one's coming to a close, I thought this would now be a good time to do so. I would personally say the Department of Government Efficiency, I think it was mostly theater and it didn't make it to the end of the year. I still think cutting any amount of government waste is a good thing, even if normally Reddit might not, since it automatically has to be against anything Orange Man does. Thoughts. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Orange Man. As I stated in the past, I think he's pretty much just going to govern like Obama or Biden does. The only difference is, Trump's whole thing is to distract people with his WWE-style banter and social media shitposting, Reddit taking the bait every single time, although being pretty much the same President Obama or Biden was in regards to policy, but he does occasionally throw libertarians a bone like he does with Doge. And yeah, personally, I think that was good, even if it didn't end up being too effective. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is, Trump's mostly just controlled opposition rather than a truly principled libertarian. Ultimately, I think his goal is just to, the president's mostly just a figure at this point. The deep state, like the CIA, NSA, FBI, all the other alpha agencies, are the ones really running the country, as I've stated numerous times in the past. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.